What I would like to do now is introduce our guest. His name is Stefan Weber. He's a botanist and restoration ecologist with a keen interest in wild plant seeds. In 2011, he completed a Master's of Science in Evolutionary Biology at the University of Guelph and will be defending his PhD at McMaster University later this summer. He's worked with more than 300 different native plants, including rare Carolinian flowers. Stefan is the founder and director of the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance, a grassroots organization that advocates for local plant populations and works with stakeholders to scale up seed orchards. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Stefan.
Hi, thanks for that introduction, Joe. Can you see my screen?
We sure can.
Okay, I'm just gonna put it into slideshow mode. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak to your group today. This is something that's really been a passion for me for the better part of a decade now. And today we're going to focus primarily on coordinating the supply and demand of native plants within the native plant and restoration industry. However, because I'm a plant nerd, I will frequently refer back to some of my favorite plants, and we will talk a little bit about some landscape design, but this is primarily going to be a talk about some of the problems, issues, opportunities, and solutions that we face in the native plant industry. So I've organized the talk into roughly 3 parts. First, I'm going to explain the good reasons that we need to use more native plants in our landscape. I'm going to talk about a recent initiative, the seed strategy for Southern Ontario, and how that ties into a horticultural-based green economy. And then we'll finish off by talking about some kind of practical best management practices, but also some design implications as well. So I tried to cover my bases. I did get your questions in advance, and I tried to work some of those answers into the slides, but I'm also looking forward to a discussion at the end of this. So to begin, if you're not sold on native plants, why is it that they are important? Well, they're the foundation of every food chain on Earth. They are also providing us with a tremendous amount of ecosystem services that have huge financial value, such as pollination, flood mitigation, erosion control, and soil fertility, which is something that we don't often talk about, is how native plants improve soil fertility. But also, plant populations themselves are toolkits. They are hubs of genetic diversity, and biodiversity, whether you're talking about genetic diversity or species diversity, simply represents solutions to the myriad problems that the world throws at a living organism, right? So this is why biodiversity is important, and particularly why plant biodiversity is important. And I probably don't need to tell you why horticulture is important, because you're all in a horticultural trade association, but I think I want to highlight why horticulture is important for conservation and for the environmental movement and for restoration generally. We sometimes think of this world carved up into properties, into countries, into backyards with fences, but the reality is we all live in the same world, and ecosystems don't recognize these boundaries, only we do. So the whole garden is a world, and it's very clear that we can impact the whole world with our intentions, good intentions, bad intentions, and horticulturalists are impacting the world every day with the plants that they put in the ground. And what I love about horticulture, and I began my plant journey as a horticulturalist primarily, what I love is that we rely on evidence-based reasoning. We have to see something work in order for us to do it again, right? We're constantly testing best practices, and so we're critical, we're purposeful, we're driven, and we're informed, and we do on the ground work. We are engaged in action every day. We're not engaged in just thought experiments, but we are engaged in boots on the ground, shovels in the dirt action. However, we do need to work a little bit on the relationship between people as horticulturalists and what we view as natural spaces. And when we take this approach, when we kind of pare back everything we've learned about what horticulture is and what it isn't, it really focuses on the plants and the land that you're in. And this is a bottom-up approach. And I think us as whether you're a farmer or you're a nursery grower, you understand that everything relies on the soil, the land, the climate, and how you and your plants relate to that land. So I'm going to just kind of highlight that I'm presenting from southwestern Ontario. I know not everybody is in this region tuning in today, but I also work with an organization called Carolinian Canada. And this is a part of the world that is very dear to me. It's the most biodiverse region in Canada. It's also the most densely populated region in Canada. So as you can imagine, the needs of nature are often in conflict with the needs of human development, which is also important. I'm not saying it's not, but we need to figure out some strategies to deal with that. And when I hear about restoration, we're entering the decade of ecological restoration, I ask for Southern Ontario, where is that restoration coming from? You don't just walk into Walmart and buy 5 billion ecologically appropriate trees off the shelf ready to go and plant in the ground. Where do those plants come from? They come from wild populations. They come from seeds. And as you can see in this photo, those sources of seeds in Southern Ontario are few and far between. This is also a region that's facing incredible environmental change, not just climate change, but land use impacts and invasive species, which I hate to break it to you, the horticulture sector has been involved in spreading around the landscape for a long time. We know this. We know it's time to stop, and there's better ways. So this is not going to be a presentation, shaming invasive plants. I'm just simply highlighting we know better and we need to move forward. So I also work with Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance. Great grassroots organization. We focus on seed collection, forming networks, sharing information, and propagating local plants for local restoration projects. Please visit our website if you want to learn more about our work. One thing that we've been engaged with for the last 5 years is really understanding what the native plant market is like in Ontario, in Southern Ontario particularly. And this is important in light of federal investment in nature-based solutions. This is a huge potential source of new demand for native plants, genetically appropriate native plants in Ontario. So the demand for local plants and seeds creates a demand for local jobs. A local seed comes from the local landscape, and so we need local experts to be doing that work. I also want to highlight that in the last few years, a Native Plant Growers Association has incorporated to advocate for the industry. And they have a website if you'd like to reach out and find out more about that group. In 2018, OPRA conducted the first native plant survey to deal with non-tree species. And the only other previous one we could find was conducted in 2011 for trees in the GTA. So the research is actually scant. When we reached out to Stats Canada, turns out federal government doesn't even track native plants specifically. This leads to all kinds of questions about predicting supply and demand at a national level, but in Ontario, we're starting to get an idea of where this demand is coming from. 2021, Carolinian Canada is about to publish their recent market survey on the demand for native plants. Overall, we are seeing a general increase in the demand spurred by investment from not only government, but also corporate investment in nature-based solutions and in green infrastructure. So we had a few hundred respondents, 53, they predicted about a 53% increase in demand over the next 3 years based on their historical demand increase. And what we found really interesting is that some people who are using native plants have a hard time finding them, and they rely on specialty nurseries that have special events, mail order, etc., to provide these plants. And they're really searching far and wide for these specialty kind of plants. Also interesting, we wanted to know why people avoid native plants sometimes and why they fail and why they're perceived as being a subpar option. And 45% of respondents noted that plants fail either due to invasive species nearby, or the plant species itself seems to be really mismatched with the local conditions. So I think there's a lot of natural history and ecological training that needs to be provided to landscape designers and people who want to use native plants and do all these good things in their design, but aren't actually familiar with the habitats and the ecology of the species that they're using. So those surveys are primarily focused on landscape and retail level demand. However, there are provincial scale demands that we didn't adequately capture in this survey. However, we did hear back from the Ministry of Transportation, and I'm about to defend my PhD, and part of that work was done in partnership with MTO to study the feasibility of recreating grassland wildflower prairie meadows on roadsides across Ontario. They have a huge amount of green space that they steward, and they want to make the best with the space that they can. There's also large demand related to resource extraction, whether it's quarries or post timber harvest. Increasingly, there's demand for compensation that cannot be met. Development policies in the province are such that things can be destroyed if they're compensated. Okay, where is that plant material coming from? If you let a field become invasive species, that's not a compensation. So there's a huge gap in the plant material that we need to do these large scale habitat creations. Also, we've seen through the pandemic, there's an increase in the need for multi-use outdoor natural spaces, trail systems, outdoor experiences. People will travel 3 hours out of Toronto to go take a selfie in a field of sunflowers. That tells you something about the need for native plants on the landscape. Okay, and one thing that can help is pooling demand. So the landscape sector in particular, we want to hear from you. We want to know what your demands are, just generally rough estimates. What plants do you use a lot? What plants would you like to see more of? How many of them do you use in a year? That kind of data is missing, and our surveys are still live. You can enter that information in the survey if you want. You can also just reach out to us directly and figure out how you'd like to get engaged that way. A number of the questions we got before the presentation today were related to procurement issues, and unfortunately the problems related to supply and demand are systemic problems, and they don't have a simple solution. So I'm going to outline some of the issues here. The demand has risen faster than you can actually collect and grow appropriate seeds in Ontario. The growers would love to provide that plant material, but it takes time. Be patient, please. Some plants can take 10 years from seed to get to a sellable format that you would want to include in a landscape design. And those timeframes are not really incorporated into the planning schedule often. Not always, but often. And some people will look to source from the US when they can't have local growers provide their needs. And that doesn't help, because that discourages local growers from scaling up. It prevents that opportunity, and it's filling a gap that could be filled. Like, we could have local jobs and local businesses benefiting from this demand, and if we keep sending that demand to the United States, we're not really helping the industry grow. So I would argue that plant procurement needs to be the first stage in any native plant landscape design, even before you've come up with your drawings and you've pitched the proposal to your client. I think you need to scan the industry, figure out what's available. I've seen a lot of unreasonable requests, such as scarlet paintbrush. This plant is a hemiparasite. It needs native, healthy grassland ecosystems to even germinate and establish. It's gorgeous, but you can't just willy-nilly incorporate it into every landscape design, and yet I've seen things like that recommended. Okay, I'm going to try to go a little faster because I want to get to the plants and the fun stuff. But if you need to source outside of Ontario, there are wild type, wild origin producers in Michigan and in New York State that could potentially satisfy your needs. And this is okay because it's tracked wild seed, it's seed grown, ethically grown, and the plants don't really recognize the border. So This is a much better option than resorting to using some unknown origin cultivar of a native plant, for example, especially if you're doing something that you're going to call restoration. Okay, so we need a strategy to deal with some of these issues, and Carolinian Canada and Opera have partnered with a number of organizations, and we're trying to conceptualize a seed conservation strategy to support restoration in Ontario, and this is inspired directly by our neighbors to the south in the US who have a national seed strategy. But there are countries around the world who are really investing time into figuring this out, how they can grow the hort sector through restoration and seed conservation. So there are a number of key skills, the key jobs that we're going to need to focus on in order to achieve seed conservation and increase the supply of native plants in Ontario. We need horticultural expertise across all levels. We need traditional ecological knowledge incorporated across all levels. We need more conservation research. We need effort being put into conserving seed sources and the habitat that surrounds them. We need massive training and education in native plant use, development, propagation, more work in restoration, stewardship, and of course, policy. So we have a few goals. Primarily, we want to engage people in restoration hands-on through the act of horticulture. People are really good at growing plants, particularly plants that grow seeds. Look at all of our major agronomic species. We grow them for their seeds, right? This is not a new concept. We just kind of need to refocus towards ecosystem restoration. We also want to support Indigenous leadership. These plants are culturally important to Indigenous people, and we need to recognize that. And they also have a stake in all conservation that we are doing on traditional territory. Obviously, this is meant to support wild plant populations. I think that's the obvious thing for me. But it's also going to hopefully support a growing native plant industry, provide local jobs, and things like that. So there's a number of actions. I'm not going to go through all of them actually at this point, but I think I should invite anybody on this call today if you'd like to be part of the seed strategy. We are looking for folks to join the task force and help us get to some of these actions. And also we're looking for people to review the strategy, which is a document. So if you're interested in either of those things, we have a few early partners right now, but we're always looking for more cooperators. So please, if you have natural land, high quality seed sources, let us know. If you'd like us to do habitat surveys to look for high quality seed sources on your land, we'd be happy to do that. We're also looking for sites for seed orchards, which I will get to in a minute. And can't say it enough, we're always looking for people who have a really strong horticultural skill set, propagation, even land preparation. We're looking for everything. And this is to help with collection and training. The more informed hands and boots we have on the ground doing this work, the better for everyone. So specifically, I'm going to go through some of these roles of cooperators that we're looking for. We are looking for land managers, and this could be private landowners, park managers, anybody who stewards land to get access to seed, to host seed orchards. Sometimes they are big, sometimes they are small, and in that case we call them a founder plot. Some of those seed orchards are related to rare and endangered species, some are related to common species that are really good for restoration and are really in high demand. One way you can get engaged is by becoming a landowner leader through Carolinian Canada, and you can visit the Carolinian Canada website, and also through In the Zone, which I will loop back to in a minute. So I want to pause here for just a second to acknowledge that we are living and working, and I'm presenting today on traditional territory, Indigenous territory, and that the Indigenous people of Southern Ontario have a much different approach to restoration and seed conservation than, I would say, Western conservation science, and how how conservation is normally done in the province. And we need to shift that a little bit. We need to focus on Indigenous leadership in restoration, conservation, and horticulture. We need to read about and learn about the local treaties that govern our landscape. And in where I'm presenting from, that's the Dish with One Spoon, which outlines that all action on the land needs to, mutually benefit both settlers and Indigenous people alike, as well as our plant and animal relatives. We need to acknowledge the cultural and traditional connection that Indigenous people had with these native plants, and recognize that plants are relatives. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I can tell you from a developmental perspective, plants are actually more similar to us than most of us realize. I also want to talk about, really quickly, I'm not an expert in these subjects, but this idea of rematriation, and that plants are relatives and they belong to a mother, which is Earth, and returning these plants is putting them back to their family and to their relatives. And this is much more than a conservation practice. This is a spiritual and cultural practice as well. So I want to just mention that before I move on. This is top of our mind while we're developing seed strategies, and we are engaging with some Indigenous partners at the early stages of the seed strategy. And so it all begins with the wild seed. And as you recall in the map I showed at the beginning, Southwestern Ontario is highly fragmented, and the seed that is left is precious, it's limited, and is undervalued. So the seed sources that are left represent all future restoration. So that is their value, all future restoration. To some, they are sacred, and to all of us, they are alive. I've heard it said, plants are people, whether we recognize it or not. They have all the same needs as we do. A number of them are quite threatened, and we really need to, think about what relationships we have with these plants. However, seeds are hopeful. They are one of the most powerful regenerative forces, and I know that might sound a little hippy-dippy, but if you think about it, it's true. Plants have been fine-tuned over millions of years to produce a high number of seeds. And if we can give those seeds the best chance possible through horticultural intervention, that's how we rebuild the relationship between plants, wild plants, and people. One of the projects I mentioned is a seed orchard, and this is a great way to take pressure off wild populations, to increase the capacity to do high quality restoration on the landscape. These are large-scale productive spaces. We call them ex situ populations, so they're not really in and amongst their wild cohorts, but they are more genetically diverse. There's more individuals, and they can provide the restoration material that we need to do this great work with, right? And this is just a really kind of quick infographic. I spent about 8 years working with the St. Williams Conservation Nursery and Ecology Center, and we had about 120, 150 different wildflowers scaled up in orchards across about 90 acres. And this is just an infographic showing butterfly weed. Here's a field of asters late in the summer at St. Williams. And these productive spaces, these farms and orchards, they're not just regenerative capacity, they are green businesses. Obviously, we sell these plants and these seeds, but the farms themselves are some of the highest quality pollinator habitat in particular that you can find. 90 acres of locally sourced native wildflowers is prime habitat. It's also an opportunity for experiential education. Imagine bringing field trips out to farms like this, and you can learn about native plants and insects in a really kind of condensed, visually appealing, exciting way. We've done wildflower safaris in these spaces, and they act as community hubs. You can imagine having your wedding photos out here in the late summer, attending a concert, perhaps an art class. And this is all part of that, green, land-based economy, and these are social and cultural co-benefits to restoration and this kind of capacity building. So in order to do this, we're always looking for local farmers to increase the amount of seed that we have in the industry. This can be difficult to start up. However, if there are projects that you know will require a large amount of seed over a stable time period, then you can set up contract grows, and farmers, nurseries can scale up these species in bulk. Also want to acknowledge that sometimes these populations can represent the largest patches of particular species left in the province. Prairie smoke was once common in southwestern Ontario, and most of the populations have been destroyed. However, there are thousands and thousands of plants at the St. William's Nursery that were grown from a tiny population found at a cemetery that has now been mowed and destroyed. So these farms are businesses, they're sources of seed, but they're also part of the conservation work itself. Okay, some of that is repeat, so I won't go over those notes. I also want to talk about, I think, one of the most active players in this conversation is the conservation sector, and there are a lot of botanists and conservation entities, NGOs, Ontario Parks, who are interested in a seed strategy and have been doing seed-based restoration for decades. This is a wonderful prairie restoration in Norfolk County conducted by Mary Gartshore and the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And the population of lupin in Norfolk was reduced to several hundred plants at one point, and there are now thousands and thousands of them across the county because of seed intervention and the local horticultural sector scaling that seed up. So conservation biologists have a lot of work to do. We're trying to understand climate change, how genetic diversity impacts restoration success. We're trying to help species at risk. We are trying to supply greater ecological goods and services through these restorations. We have a big job to do, and we also have a job in terms of incorporating traditional ecological knowledge in all of these types of projects. And so I'm going to digress for 2 minutes to talk to you more about rare legumes in Norfolk County. The bean family is the third or fourth most biodiverse plant family in the entire world. And as you probably know, they're incredibly ecologically important because they fix nitrogen and they improve soil quality, right? However, most of them in Ontario are either endangered or rare, uncommon, or threatened. This is a wood vetch, a native vicia that lives in savannas, and there's only one population left in Norfolk County. Similarly, this is a pale vetchling, one population left in Norfolk County. Creeping tick trefoil, one population left in Norfolk County. This is a gorgeous dry shade ground cover that produces little bean flowers and feeds the pollinators. This is a Virginia goat's rue. This is a legume that is endangered in Canada. There's only one population that is left. And it's impacted by Eurasian weevils, by off-trail, use, ATV use, all kinds of things. So these are some of the plants that we're trying to help with the seed strategy. And I have a particular fondness for legumes because of their ecological importance, and we don't use enough of them in landscaping. Also want to take this moment to highlight that this plant, dense blazing star, is used frequently in landscape design, even before I'll call the native plant movement began. However, I want to remind you that this is a rare and endangered plant in Canada. And if you choose one for your landscape design, please choose the wild type. You'll be helping the local population so much more than if you choose a cultivar that you've imported from Oregon. So that's just kind of my pleading my case for dense blazing star. There's also a huge job for ethnobotanists in the seed strategy. We're looking to focus on growing culturally significant plants. These are plants that have edible and medicinal values. And we are looking for ways to tell stories about native plants from the perspective of Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures, and bring that storytelling back to native plants. So there is a role for landscape designers too. We talked earlier about pooling demand, and I think that's the most valuable thing that the seed strategy could use from the landscape design sector. We want to know what are your top 30 most used, sought after native plants, and we can help you maybe pool this by region, GTA, Kitchener, Waterloo, whatever, so that we can help nurseries in those regions collect seed and grow more plants of those species. That's the basic info that we need from landscape designers, and we need it whether you have a project confirmed or not. We just want to know what you're thinking and what you love to use. So we will get to the ecological reference and some contract growing in just a bit, but I do want to acknowledge that there are a number of native plant growers already in Ontario, and we have a list of them on the Carolinian Canada website here. I'm not sure if you can post that in the chat, but these nurseries are all in the zone certified, which means the seeds have been collected locally, ethically, and the plants have been grown without the use of neonics. There's a few other criteria as well, but this helps the buyer, the purchaser, know that they're getting a truly native species. And you may have seen some of these plants for sale at your local garden center. They were at a variety of Loblaws and other retail vendors this summer and last summer. So again, this is a little plug for the In the Zone tag, and visit the website for a list of nurseries. So I want to talk quickly, hopefully, about ecological referencing and matching plants to site conditions. Take a hike locally. Learn what your local soil conditions are like out in the wild where the plants are thriving, and find the sites that mimic yours or kind of seem like yours, and then look at the plants that are growing there. So here's a bit of a reference of the 16 Mile Creek in Oakville, and you have everything there from a wet sedge meadow, you have eroding gravel prairies on top of that ledge, you have clay slopes, you have wet lowland, clay wetlands there, and there's a lovely palette of wildflowers and shrubs that thrive in each of those conditions. So you can take a hike. You can also use your local conservation authority might have lists of plants that are found in the region and the habitats that they occur in. Please join Opera. We have workshops frequently. We have references like this little infographic available on our website. So do check those out. I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about different native plants to use for your garden today, but all of my personal recommendations are up on the Opera website. And we have planting palettes designed for rock gardens or xeriscaping, for rain gardens, for pollinator gardens, although every garden is a pollinator garden, and shade gardens, particularly for dry shade. So visit the Opera website for some inspiration. We've got some different visuals to help show what the planting design might look like using these different species. And now I think with the last few minutes I have, I'm just going to talk about some of my favorite native plants and why I'm surprised they're not being grown more. This is twin leaf, gorgeous spring ephemeral, looks like a bloodroot on steroids. It is ephemeral, so it doesn't last long, but it has these gorgeous purpley orange leaves that emerge first thing in the spring, lovely white flowers, and what's best about them is that they tolerate compact shaded clay. They need a little bit of moisture, but not much. The wood betony, again, great for dry shade, gorgeous whorls of yellow flowers, attracts all kinds of bumblebees, and it flowers in that really awkward period between spring and summer when your garden kind of is missing a bit of color. That's what I find anyway. These plants are hemiparasites as well, but they will parasitize on a wide variety of other plants, sedges, grasses, etc. and they too have this kind of neat purpley orange foliage first thing in the spring as they are emerging, and it's just as attractive as the flowers. There are all kinds of milkweeds in Ontario besides swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed that are really great for landscaping. World milkweed is a tiny little clumping one, drought tolerant, loves full sun. It can be used on green roofs, in planters, as a perennial border. It's gorgeous. It does support monarch butterflies and attracts a wide variety of other pollinators. My favorite is the Sullivan's milkweed, which looks like a bigger, more pink purpley version of common milkweed, except that it doesn't spread in a patch. It stays pretty clumped and it's a little bit lower, but otherwise showy. And back to the legumes. This is a gorgeous green milk vetch. The flowers are very orchid-like. It produces a shrubby habit, so you get a shrub effect from it, but it dies back to the ground every year, kind of like a wild senna. But this plant loves dry semi-shade, so it's good for woodland gardens as well as pollinator sun gardens. Viburnums are always great in landscaping. My favorite is the southern arrowwood. It has these really cool mottled pink and purple berries. In the wild, it's found at the edge of wetlands, but I have mine planted in just a normal, dry, sunny garden, and it's really gorgeous. It's fairly compact. The leaves are quite glossy and attractive. Also, American bittersweet. Gosh, we need to stop selling Oriental bittersweet. It's an invasive plant. The American bittersweet is even more attractive than the Oriental bittersweet, so we need to be growing this one. And the difference is that American bittersweet has all the berries clustered right at the end of the stem. So confirm with your supplier that you're getting the American bittersweet. Okay, and I understand that there's going to be a lot of questions about seed collection, production planning, those kinds of things. A lot of our partners have had those questions already. We are happy to provide that kind of support to you if you're looking to get involved in native plant growing and native seed collection. And as I said earlier, it can take a number of years, at least 3 or 4 years, to go from a target plant that you want to collect seed from to actually having a potted plant that you could sell. Okay, a few last things. I am almost done. One of the kind of technical best practices we're trying to develop for the sector is a universal seed origin tracking system so that everybody can be sure exactly where their seeds have come from and that they are truly native. This is a system that I believe is derived from an M&R tree lot coding system, and it's pretty much the system we used at St. William's Nursery. However, a number of other native plant growers use this, and it's really handy. Again, we're still trying to come up with the best approach, so we'd love to hear from you. One way that you can get involved, again, if you are managing your own garden at home, or if you have clients that are really interested in native plants, encourage them to sign up within the zone. We have the tag program, but we also have a garden tracking program. We are currently tracking over 5,500 private landowners and land managers and gardeners across mostly southern Ontario, and this is a subset of conservation folks who have not really been heard from. We've not done a good job of accounting for the conservation that gardeners are doing on the landscape. We kind of think that conservation happens in these reserves, in these, wildlife areas, but they're happening everywhere. We want to I want to reiterate that this is one world where there are no fences between our gardens. Plants don't recognize these kinds of boundaries, and we need to work together. And I think our goal is really to amplify the value, the power of horticulture itself in getting this job done. So with that, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to ask you please to consider joining the seed strategy. We have a number of projects in the works that are in development that will help support the seed strategy moving forward, including some financial incentives, some public-private partnerships. So we are at a stage where we're confident in our growth, and we're really excited to pull people into the conversation, and hopefully Landscape Ontario is interested in joining the seed strategy. But if individuals on the call are also interested, we'd love to hear from you as well. I will stop and take some questions for now. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Stefan. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of, we have a question and a comment. Jean is saying, from blooming boulevards in Mississauga, they'd love to be able to help in any way. They can propagate indigenous native plants from seeds they gather locally. So it looks like you have a potential partner right there. So we can help you guys
great.
connect. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, and sorry, I just wanted to say I forgot to mention, I think, that the seed strategy concept isn't new. There are all kinds of organizations across Ontario who have been doing this for a long time, and it's great. I think we maybe just need to connect and help each other grow.
Sounds
yeah,
good.
So happy to hear from you.
Wonderful. I also did want to mention that this being an all-chapter virtual meeting, typically as part of these meetings, we would do breakout rooms, but today's session is a lunch and learn, so we will not be doing the breakout rooms to follow, just so that you know that ahead of time. Mohan is asking, what about native trees? There's a lot of talk about herbaceous non-woody plants. Native trees should also be part of landscaping and support a lot of native biodiversity. To a large native tree can support more biomass diversity compared to a meadow.
So absolutely, but we need all of these plants. In some ways, we've focused a little bit less on trees because there is Forest Ontario focusing on trees. There's also the Forest Gene Conservation Association, which focuses particularly on tree seed conservation and collection. And the FGCA is one of our early partners of the seed strategy. So absolutely, trees are important too. Opera tends to focus on herbaceous plants because there are a number of them that are regionally rare but not being protected in any way. But we've worked with sycamore, we've worked with chinkapin oak. So I don't want you to think that we're not considering trees, but that's a good point. Thank you for reminding me.
And looks like Brandon Goddard mentioned that they just purchased a greenhouse and would be very interested in helping. So looks like you have another potential partner. And then Joyce in Kingston, we're not in the zone, though we have some Carolinian species. With climate change, will you be looking at expanding in the zone beyond its current boundary?
Right, yeah. So you don't need to be in the Carolinian zone to actually sign up in the zone. We have folks in the US and Northern Ontario, a few. So yeah, feel free to join within the zone. We're constantly talking about where the boundary of the Carolinian zone ought to be. Realistically, like biologically, that edge is hazy anyway because there are disjunct populations that represent Carolinian species into the Ottawa Valley, and certainly Prince Edward County has a number of, we would consider Carolinian-esque plant communities. So we're not too rigid about the Carolinian zone itself. You brought up climate change. I think we do need to consider where plants ought to be in the future and how we are preventing them currently from moving where they ought to be. So that being said, the process of assisted migration is actually incredibly complex. One of my PhD chapters was on local adaptation and assisted migration, and I can say that it is context specific, species specific in every case. So it does need to be handled as a conservation science issue. Not to say that it's never a good idea, but it needs to be approached with a little bit of caution.
And it looks like that's it for the questions, at least for now. If more questions do come in following the session, then we'll be sure to get those off to you, Stefan. But thank you on behalf of Landscape Ontario, Board of Directors, and the broader Landscape Ontario community. Thank you so much for your expertise and your time. We very much do appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. And to everyone that's joined us today, thank you so much. And I'm sure Kanisha will be sending out the recording as soon as she's able to get that uploaded. So thank you so much. We'll see you next time. I know that we have another all chapter meeting coming up. And thank you so much, Stefan. And Kanisha will send out the link to the next one. So I hope we see you all there. Take care. A bit of an update. It's been a little while since we've had an all chapter virtual event. So thank you again for joining us. It has been some time. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day, especially this beautiful day here at the end of July. So a couple of updates. Landscape Ontario is planning Congress, at least the trade show portion, in person. The conference will be virtual, however, but the trade show will be in person. So we were so looking forward to that, to get back to in-person events. LO's been a homecoming for many of us, and we just can't wait. Hopefully we'll be able to see everybody in person. There's been much conversation and decision-making around the future of Canada Blooms, and we're hopeful that we'll have more information that we can share with everyone in the coming month or so. Landscape Trades magazine, which we all get, is getting a fresh makeover. And that's, some time coming. All things kind of get a refresh every once in a while. And so the communications team has been busy reworking what Landscape Trades will look like in the new format. So we're going to be looking at something pretty fantastic from what I understand. The GROW program. So if you haven't seen or heard anything about this fantastic program, it's all about recruiting the great people for the industry. So those are unemployed or precariously employed in the regions of Hamilton, Toronto, Muskoka, and Kawartha. We're looking at, we've been gifted this fantastic funding to be able to do this. And the idea here is that Landscape Ontario does all the recruiting, all of the training, and then we set up those trained employees with employers of choice within the LO community. And so this program not only trains new recruits, but current employees and landscape business owners. So again, it is our second year of a pilot program. So it is still a pilot, which is why it's only being run in 3 regions. But if we deliver on our goals and it's successful, it's very possible that we'll be able to expand this to the entire province. So that's absolutely in our sights. With LO Apprenticeship, we've also been gifted some incredible funding through the hard work of Sally Harvey and her team. There's just so many incentives and benefits of sponsoring an apprentice or several apprentices. So if you haven't taken us up on that, please do. We can definitely share some information about that and how to get involved. Apprenticeship is definitely a way to attract and retain quality people. Speaking of, Landscape Ontario is seeing record numbers for membership. In fact, we're on pace for this fiscal year to reach almost 600 new members. So that is our target, and we're well on pace to do that. From my understanding, this hasn't happened in the same fashion in our history. And so we're just so fortunate. So if you know a company that should be a member, please refer them. I mean, let's continue to grow this fantastic, this amazing community. The more of us, the better, the more the merrier. Some of LO's chapters have started planning some in-person events as COVID-19 restrictions start to loosen, which is really exciting. I can't wait to get back to in-person and meet those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to meet in person. And so some golf tournaments are being planned, some networking events are being planned. So stay tuned for more information as more details become available.